All right, family, let's go ahead and get after it. We are again addressing the European worldview, European psyche, and global white domination. In this unit, we'll talk about the great late Dr. Frances Cress Welsing and her model and theories of color confrontation. Dr. Cress Welsing is very important to African psychologists. She was a psychiatrist, and in her work, she emphasized this challenge of wanting to understand exactly why European people mistreated African people and what was the root of the mistreatment. Almost, why they do us like that. So Cress Welsing sought to solve this riddle and really kind of look into what the challenge or phenomenon was for Europeans in their treatment of African people. So she looked at European behavior and, as any scientist would, conducted some analysis. Now, according to Welsing, there is no other race of people who operates on the basis of color or racial supremacy except for white, European, or Caucasian. Nowhere else in the world was there this creation, a generation of a supremacy or doctrine outside of the European race. Dr. Welsing defines racism as white rule and domination. She identifies that white racism is actually the only functional racism in the universe. And as we discussed in a previous unit, Europeans have been very successful in their efforts to utilize race for domination and control. So Dr. Cress Welsing came up with a theory known as the Cress theory of color confrontation, based on her studies with her greats Jegna Neely Fuller. She identified the foundation of what she detailed as color confrontation, or why European people act in a social dynamic around the way they do around race. And she identified first the genetic factor. One piece, very important component in this Cress theory of color confrontation, is that European people suffer from color inadequacy, which is a deficient state, white skin color, or albinism, or a variant. As a result, European people, compared to people of color, European people not having color, are a numeric minority in the world. She also articulated that individual and group psychological response to that was the development of psychological defense mechanisms. We're going to break all this down in a few moments, but it's important to go through and flow through the theory. She said and argued that in order to compensate, European people created this system of domination and control that's been implemented throughout the world, and also facilitated compensatory behaviors such as practices in economics, education, entertainment, law, labor, politics, religion, sex, and war, where she identified the 9 areas of people activity. We added the 10th, which is health, meaning that racism, colonization, domination, and control are integrated into the system that is supported by white domination and control. It's implemented as a part of the behavioral system and culture on a worldwide scale, which then manifests as a systematic oppression, domination, and inferiorization of all people with the capacity to produce significant amounts of melanin skin pigment. starting with black, brown, red, and yellow peoples of the earth. So the Cress theory of color confrontation is deep. So Mama Frances Cress Welsing really studied the phenomenon of hatred, violence, aggression towards people of color, but African people specifically, and wanted to understand this model, which she debated with several different people. Now remember, we're going back through the theory, and she identifies that white racism, again, is the only functional racism in the world. That the racism is rooted in this genetic factor that's associated with the absence of color, a biogenetic condition of melanin deficiency or albinism. Then she argues that as a result, the European feels inferior or inadequate. And like we talked about before, based on Michael Bradley's model, and we'll talk later about Bobby Wright's work, European people struggle with any sort of deficiency or feeling of inadequacy. So the awareness of being a numeric minority status in the world based on color pigmentation causes a clear understanding, whether it is conscious, aware, or unconscious, a feeling of the threat to white genetic survival. So Dr. Frances Cress Welsing argues that European people fear being annihilated genetically by superior pigmented race. Therefore, the aggression that is given to those groups of people come from that fear of white genetic annihilation. So melanin is a very important component. It is very adaptive in terms of its function. Melanin impacts the nervous system. It's connected to higher order brain functioning, perpetual and motor coordination, a broad range of sensory receptivity. We believe it's connected to the spirit peace, high level consciousness as well. So melanin is deep. And so when you have the beautiful African black melanated skin, you have a production that reflects a normative condition for human beings. To produce melanin is normal. The lack of melanin production represents a genetically recessive or abnormal condition among human beings. Ultimately, whites possess an abnormal and defective genetic constitution relative to African people. So, this pushes a neurotic drive based on defense mechanisms for superiority. And we also argued earlier, based on a couple of theorists' model, that European people, what undergirds the European worldview is a drive for superiority. So, having to acknowledge that whites are genetically inferior to Africans is a serious blow to the European sanity or the European ego. So to address this blow to the European ego, Europeans developed psychological defense mechanisms. Again, and we broke that down in all of the Cress theory, that one first page we went through. So again, it argues that the psychological defense mechanism represents the necessity for the European psyche to activate these defense mechanisms. The activation of the defense mechanism essentially protects the emotion from total devastation and self-destruction. But what happens is repression, reaction formation, and projection. Projection could be something in the vein of black people are out to get me, so then I'm going to get them type of phenomenon. So again, based on Welsing's model, black Africans represent, again, the most heavily pigmented race of human beings. Black man, white woman, black baby. White woman, Black man. Wait. White man, black woman, black baby. Black man, black woman, black baby. 75%. So the issue of the fear of genetic annihilation comes from that 25% white woman, white man, white baby that is produced. So the Cress theory of color confrontation challenges and analyzes the system of European domination and racism around treatment of black people. And Dr. Frances Cress Welsing was very articulate in her ability, very scholarly in her ability to analyze and articulate what is at the root of Europeans' aggression towards African people. And again, the challenge was the fear of white genetic annihilation. So again, black people, specifically black males, pose the biggest threat to white genetic survival. So Welsing's model continued to emphasize why black African people are feared, but most importantly, why the black man is feared the most. And it is because of the black individual's ability to produce melanin, because of the black and African individual's ability to naturally produce color, and it's a implementation of that psychological defense mechanism. So the hostility, the aggression towards black people, again, result of the psychological defense mechanism. So it works against their underlying feelings of inferiority and inadequacy, fear and envy towards black people and other pigmented races. So again, these defense mechanisms are very important to understand. I encourage you in the chat to share some examples, come up with some of defense mechanisms that are used to help to calm the European ego. But these things occur on an ongoing basis. Remember, we talked about the envy. Where's my pointer? Toward blacks and other pigmented races. Envy, meaning being devoid of color, causes the European to want to have color because of the color deficiency. So Europeans then have sun tanning rituals to help them to get color. And of course, the color is only temporary, which is why it's a sun tanning ritual. Also, a defense mechanism is a gross negative stereotyping of blacks. And when we deal with the negative stereotypes, we also can address the predominance of negative color symbolism. Lynching and physical assault. Again, we talked about the aggression towards black men in particular, but black people, African people in general. And the concentration on the black male organ, concentrated attacks on black male organs during the times where Europeans, during and after slavery, had picnics. Their goal was to pick an N-word, an African, enslaved African, to choose to aggressively and violently hang the black person. And the prize from that picnic was who got to put the genitals of the black person in a jar on their mantle above their fireplace. Again, we're dealing with Cress theory of color confrontation. It's an important component of the color symbolism. We'll continue in the next section talking about Bobby Wright's theory of psychopathic racial personality. Appreciate y'all. Peace.